Playing at Business with Steve Reese, the business podcast with a sense of fun. To find out more, go to playingatbusiness.com.
Hello, and welcome to episode 9 of the Playing at Business podcast. I'm your host, Steve Reese, and today we're looking at one of the most perennial categories in the toy industry. That's board games. Now, personally speaking, I've always loved board games, but this is not a fan-type podcast. Other people do that better than me, frankly. So we're going to take a look at the business of board games. We're going to look at some trends, and we're going to look at the way that board games are categorised. And we're going to look at some perennial features of this much-loved category and, I guess, the future prospects for board games. So, by way of introduction, firstly, let me start by stating that my all-time favourite board games, personally, are Risk, Diplomacy, and for a simple party game, Double. I just thought I'd get that out of the way because normally that's the first feedback I get when I discuss games is, what are your favourite games? So, I guess more importantly, looking at this from a kind of a historical perspective, board games have been around for thousands of years. And there are many, many ancient games which have come and gone and been long forgotten. In fact, if you search for ancient or historical board games, it's actually quite staggering how many you'll be able to find. But most of these, over time, have been kind of lost or at least forgotten from mass market gameplay. Chess would be an example of a game that's been with us a very long time and which is still as popular as ever. And reportedly, chess dates back to the 6th century, possibly in India, although there is some dispute about exactly where it comes from. And obviously the format has changed slightly since it was first conceived, I guess. But you know, for as long as board games have been played, someone's been inventing the games, developing them, someone's been producing them, and someone's been selling them. So, you know, this is a really ancient business, and those of us who wander into this business today, or even in the last decade or so, you know, would do well to probably remember that so much has been before in this space that, you know, that most people don't even pay any attention to in the trade itself. You know, even going back 100 years or thereabouts, there was a richly established board games business with some really famous board game names fighting it out in the marketplace. So, for instance, Milton Bradley, the famous American games company, now owned by Hasbro, obviously, and has been for quite some time, dates back to 1860, I believe. Parker Brothers, another long-established traditional board games company, which achieved great success, was established in the 1880s, and again, now owned by, or long owned by, Hasbro. So, you know, this is not a new phenomenon. And actually, one of the things I would like you to take away from this podcast really is there's a really interesting book I'd like you to read called The Game Makers by Phil Orbanes. This is a fascinating study of the story of Parker Brothers and, you know, all the commercial pressures that they were under, the tumultuous times that they traded through, all these just amazing stories in that book. So if there was one book I would recommend on the kind of the history of the board games business, it would probably be that one, not because it's entirely holistic, but because it's such a great profile of one of the most influential board games companies there's ever been. So I guess all history lessons aside, you know, the bottom line is this is a category with really rich heritage. You know, there is a reason normally why something lasts for a very long time. That's because there's some large degree of substance behind it. And in this day of, you know, modern day age of apps, of really in-depth PC games or online games with amazing graphics and, you know, really addictive gameplay, it's easy to forget that people have been playing games for, you know, many generations. You know, vast civilizations have come and gone in the time that, you know, board games have been around. So they are, in a sense, timeless. So I always do laugh when I read a media article, normally in the run-up to Christmas, often, frankly, prompted by perhaps a board games industry company or a PR company, that, you know, board games are back. I mean, the reality is they have never ever gone away. So, you know, I don't expect them to either, because there are some really fundamental reasons why people play with board games, why people buy board games. So, Just to try and kind of list some of those, just for the record. I mean, I think the bottom line is, one word: fun. I guess going back 20 or 30 years, maybe even a bit longer than that, when I first started playing board games myself, I can observe that even in my lifetime, we've gone from there being not that many entertainment mediums or media versus what there are today. So there was less to do in the times when board games play was perhaps first deeply ingrained in entertainment. But actually, the interesting thing is that even today, with all these this huge array of media, of entertainment content, so much distraction, so much device addiction, board game sales have not gone down. In fact, quite to the contrary. They've over time, after a bit of a lull, perhaps a few years back, started to rise reasonably significantly. And there are a number of things driving that, but at the end of the day, if there was no fun to be had in playing a board game, then they wouldn't have lasted for thousands of years. This category, this business would not have lasted for thousands of years. Really simple. I think the other reason why people play board games is that board games can be almost like a tool or a facilitator for social interaction. So the example I normally give is, a couple of years ago, I had a load of people around on a Saturday for dinner and drinks, a load of adults this is, and everyone was a bit tired. They'd maybe done some kind of sporting activity during the day, or they'd had a tough week, so the energy level was really low. So I brought out a game. It's one of my favourite games to play today. A really simple game, but so compelling, so dynamic, called Double, published by Asmodee. And this game is in some ways the epitome of what a good game should be, and that it's pretty simple. It's not very complicated, so it's very, very accessible. Anyone can play it. But actually, it's just so compelling. And we went from a situation whereby everybody was sat back, really low energy, hardly speaking, to absolute frenzy. I mean, literally like a frenzy within the space of about 30 seconds. And the only difference was the introduction of this kind of social facilitator. And from there, everybody proceeded to have an amazing evening. Far too much wine was drunk. Lots of inane banter was had, and basically everyone had a great time. But the game itself was the social facilitator, and that has not changed, certainly in my lifetime. I guess another reason why people would play board games, perhaps to occupy the children. Anyone who's had children will dread those few words that can kind of mean so much destruction and chaos. I'm bored. If a child comes to you and says, I'm bored, normally you'll want to do something about it, because that's when kids can become a little bit troublesome and get up to kind of hijinks that maybe you don't want them to. So, kids have often been palmed off with board games, amongst other things. But I think on a more positive note, combined with that kind of playing board games with kids or kind of introducing kids to board games, sometimes it's about sharing those golden family moments. We would all tend to remember playing games like Monopoly or Clue in North America, Cluedo outside North America, and to introduce these to our own children is actually something that most parents will aspire to and will actively want to do. I guess another reason why people play board games is perhaps slightly more intellectually oriented, in the sense that kind of a mental stimulation or challenge. So I guess games like chess would be an example of this. You wouldn't necessarily want to play chess if you were mentally tired or if you just wanted to relax, because obviously you have to think very hard. And there are other strategy games as well where the level of complexity means that it is definitely mentally challenging and certainly stimulating. And for some people, that's obviously of real attraction. So I just wanted to run through, having looked at why people play board games, just run through some of the main categories of board games. Kind of, it sits aside why and who plays board games really, but I'm not going to list every single subcategory of gaming, but the main ones, certainly from a commercial perspective, would be party games, once known as adult games, but I guess that definition has died out as adult kind of Hasidia undertones. And yeah, this kind of party game, I guess it's generally to lighten the mood and stimulate social interaction at gatherings, kind of dinner parties or whatever else. Like I described, we myself and my family and friends used Double for family games. So back to I mentioned Monopoly and Clue or Cluedo. Double as well could actually be played as a family game. This is parents and kids sharing moments. There's a whole load of things which parents can teach their kids via games. Sometimes it's positive lessons like you need to take your turn. Sometimes it's learning about how money works. Sometimes it's learning about who you can trust and who you can't trust. Mentioning no names. Certainly that's all part of the reason why parents would want to play games. So family games is a definite category. Kids, which I guess is the classic Guess Who, Connect 4 type of games, but also increasingly nowadays it's kind of some form of silly action like pie face game where custard pie is effectively thrown in someone's face. Increasingly this category is dominated by animal themed games, so there's some kind of plastic animal and it leads towards some sort of big payoff moment at the end when the animal does something funny. Mass market wise, kids is probably the lowest common denominator in that it can appeal to nearly every child. Price points tend to be lower. They don't tend to be very complicated games, but that's how many people enter their first experience of board game play is that type of game. I guess of increasing importance in the last probably 5 or 10 years, I guess, is and there are many different ways to describe this area. So I'm going to kind of name just a few of them so that it's a bit catch-all. So kind of hobby games, gamers games, strategy games, Euro games. These are the kind of games that are far more in depth for enthusiasts. So the kind of the Ticket to Ride, Carcassonne, all these kind of games, Settlers of Catan, classic versions of games in this genre. And this has definitely grown over the last decade or so. This whole area as games have kind of become cooler and just had broader appeal. Trading card games and collectible card games. Now in a way this is a bit different in the sense that it sometimes moves away from the actual gameplay itself and becomes more about collecting or even deck building. There tends to be some crossover with the kind of the hobbyist or the gamers games, but this is a big category and it's often driven by particular brands or intellectual property. So two major ones would be Magic the Gathering and Pokemon, both of which are really great games based on really strong game mechanics. Interestingly, a completely different marketing model for trading card games and collectible card games. The party games, family games, kids games tend to be the mass market games that might be TV advertised. They'll be driven by reviews online, all that kind of stuff. Trading card games is a bit more about finding enthusiasts to play with, and that's obviously that crosses over as well into the kind of the hobbyist or gamers games section as well. And I guess you could highlight traditional card games, so like people playing with a kind of a deck of playing cards, playing bridge or poker or whatever else. So those are the main categories really. In terms of the trends, I guess this is where we go from being kind of like introductory level to, I guess, hopefully a bit of food for thought for those people who are themselves kind of expert in this category. I think the biggest trend that I can identify in my time in the toy industry and in board games is the trend from product selection being driven by gatekeepers to actually starting to become driven by the end consumer, the player themselves. So what do I mean by that? Well, gatekeeper, traditionally the process would work that if an originator, an inventor, an author, call them what you like, had an idea, they would take it to a board games company who would screen hundreds, in some cases thousands of game concepts, and then launch a few. Their retailers would then tell them which ones of these new games they would be willing to put on the shelf. So effectively, then before the consumer can buy or could buy these games from a retail store, there had to be two levels of gatekeeping approvals before they had that chance. So what tended to happen was anything which was risque, anything which was different, anything which was off the wall, anything which was, I guess, not politically correct, or not the kind of thing that parents might want to see on a shelf where they're walking with their children. All these things would kind of be excluded just by the natural effects of having two levels of risk-averse gatekeepers. And frankly speaking, at the kind of the peak of that gatekeeper effect, I felt like the board games industry had gone very stale and very formulaic and was not particularly healthy. And this situation, if it had kind of continued, wouldn't have been brilliant for the health of the category overall, in my own opinion. But what happened to change that was actually, I guess, the mass consumer adoption of the internet. Aside from kind of online reviews and that kind of thing, actually the ability for originators to go directly to the people who would buy and play their games via crowdfunding, probably most notably in board games via Kickstarter. Games like Exploding Kittens and Cards Against Humanity, they would have been quite unlikely to get onto shelf in any quantity previously, before crowdfunding existed. But because they could prove out the concept and prove that there was sufficient interest to make a first manufacturing run, and then word of mouth itself helped to spread, and eventually has led to a position whereby these games have sold in really significant quantities on a completely different kind of paradigm or model to all those traditional games and traditional game categories. So I think this effect is actually still in its infancy, and what tends to happen therefore is that you see games which would be perceived as being silly or too basic or not interesting enough or not different enough or too out there. All these things can have a chance. I mentioned Pie Face earlier. Pie Face became a viral hit and was taken on by Hasbro, and then became a massive global hit at retail because of both of those factors. Would and could Hasbro have launched that product without the pre-viral push? They certainly could have done. You could argue that they might have been unlikely to actually have done that for various reasons. The reality is they didn't, and but lo and behold, the consumer has proven what they want, and the industry has followed that reactively and and delivered. And this is, like I say, is a completely different paradigm, and for me actually helps to secure the future for the board games category to a very significant degree. It's so much in a healthier place than it was, and not everything will work, not everything gets supported, but those few things that come through that way help to keep the whole industry healthier, and that's got to be a good thing. I think in terms of other board game market trends, obviously the huge social phenomenon, arguably problem that we're dealing with as a society is kind of screen time. We went from kids loving to watch TV and perhaps playing on video games via the TV screen to even young kids having smartphones, which are obviously designed to be addictive and hard to put down. So one of the things that's very definitely the case is that both adults and kids today need almost like some prompts to get off screens, and certainly parents are increasingly using board games and other toys to prompt kids to get off screens, and that's a good thing for the board games category as a whole. Although the reality is probably the amount of time which consumers will put into playing board games en masse or in general, as opposed to kind of real enthusiasts, it's probably less than it was 30 years ago, because there are all these other things to do, all these distractions. So I think the other trend I would highlight is that we're definitely seeing more games as kind of throwaway gifts as much as playthings. I'd like to know how many, what percentage of games sold end up in a cupboard in shrink wrap and end up going to a charity store or just finding their way into the bin eventually. Which is kind of a sad thing. I mean, commercially speaking, I guess if they still sell, they still sell. But I think the other thing I would highlight on this is I actually had to do a project for someone where I researched some 1980s board games adverts and toy adverts as well, I should say. It's a very interesting project, but actually what struck me was in those days when they advertised the price points more so than they can over today, that actually the hard price points have not really increased since, perhaps when I was a child playing games 30 or more years ago, 35 years ago. So, yes, okay, we've got better at making them. Yes, they've been kind of value engineered or kind of cost reduced in many cases. But the reality is, if after 30 to 35 years it's still the same kind of hard price, then obviously because of inflation, this is no longer a really considered purchase. It can be seen as a throwaway purchase. So, if you can get a top kids or family game for, £10 in my home market, $15 or, 15, 20 euros in Europe, that's like a light lunch or a few drinks in a bar nowadays. So obviously, therefore, board games products are much more accessible. The other thing I've noticed, frankly, perhaps this is more a London and UK thing, but kind of games for hipsters has become a thing. There's a certain degree of kudos and coolness about games, which there hasn't always been. And there's some really quite cool board games cafes springing up, and that is not just in the UK, that's definitely around the world as well. So that's a good trend. Manufacturing wise, quite interestingly, we've probably seen more nearshoring in the last 5 years or so because China's become less attractive on price in recent years versus kind of closer to home manufacturing. There are, however, some really good board games factories in China with a lot of expertise and knowledge, and obviously those are increasing. The Asian market is certainly increasing and is probably the fastest growing market for games and toys around the world. So I wouldn't be too worried if I was a board games factory in China from that perspective. But yeah, obviously there's been a bit more nearshoring. And I guess, the other major trend, which I've touched on, but I should call out, is I guess you can probably observe a move from probably even 10 years ago, but certainly 20 or 30 years ago, a TV game show was watched by a large percentage of the viewing audience and would easily lend itself to a board game. So TV game show games were often the things that defined whether the category was up or down. If there was a really popular TV game show on the up, then the category would be on the up because of sales of, the 5 or 6 different versions and different formats of games on that game show. And when one was on the decline and the next one hadn't come, perhaps the category would be down. What's changed, though, is that now I think we're much more driven by reviews and kind of peer-to-peer, word of mouth, frankly, as much online and via social media, but also the kind of the full-time social media channels who are just reviewing products. That's in some ways a fantastic enhancer for the category because it means that quality wins out. Obviously, if you're the kind of company that crank out crappy games with a kind of popular theme, you know what, frankly, that kind of model is probably going to do slightly worse than it used to. But, there's still a place, everything in its place, I guess. So those are the key board games market trends that I see nowadays. So I think if I were to summarise, I would say that, as I've already said, board games have been around for thousands of years, and I laugh when, someone in the media announces there's a board games comeback. They've never gone away. At this moment in time, I cannot conceive why they would go away, because they're such a big part of popular culture and the way we bring our children up and the way we entertain ourselves. So, at this stage, we've survived the invention of radio, TV, cinema and moving pictures, the internet, social media, Netflix, and heaven knows what's going to come next. So, the reason why people play games are as relevant today, and arguably even more so than they ever have been. So, in my opinion, we can expect those kind of perennial classic performers to keep going strong for the foreseeable future, which is a great thing. But also we can see this kind of extension into perhaps more extreme or more niche board games themes and categories as the shift to consumer or gaming consumer product selection matures versus the old kind of gatekeeper driven version. And actually, again, I think that's a really good thing for the category. So, bottom line is it's a great time, I think, for board games. 2 recommendations I would just make to end this podcast. Firstly, I already referenced the book by Phil Urbain's The Game Makers, which is the story of Parker Brothers. I also published an ebook myself on Amazon called 55 Features of Top-Selling Board Games. It's very basic, and it's more like a list than it is an actual narrative book. But having sat down and analysed, all the top-selling games that I knew of or that I'd seen, I came up with a list of 55, which is completely arbitrary, but hey. So you can find that book, should you be interested, on Amazon in various countries. It's not particularly expensive, but then it's not particularly long, so don't expect to have it as holiday reading on a 3-month sabbatical, because it probably won't take you very long to read. Anyway, thanks again for joining us this time. I've been Steve Rees. This has been the Playing at Business podcast, and hopefully we'll see you next time. Thanks, and bye.
Playing at Business with Steve Rees, the business podcast with a sense of fun. To find out more, go to playingatbusiness.com.